Hey everybody, and welcome back to Jim's Garage. Today we're going to be looking at Proxmox Backup Server to make sure that our VMs are backed up in the best possible way. So if you've been watching my videos, you know that I've gone quite heavily into the worlds of backup strategies, invoking things like a 3-2-1 for example. We've also looked at tools like Restick and rclone, and certainly that Restick should give you an idea or at least a hint as to why we're going down the Proxmox Backup Server route. Now for those of you who've been using Proxmox for a long time, specifically the VE, the virtual environment, you'll know that it has a backup option within that. And you might be thinking, I've been using that, it works fine, why would I want to spin up something like Proxmox Backup Server? Well, as I just mentioned with things like Restick, where we saw the introduction of deduplication, that's the exact benefit of using something like Proxmox Backup Server. So what's deduplication? Well, think of it a bit like this. If you're using Proxmox VE, every time you back up your machine, it's creating a replica. Good. But there's no logic or intelligence behind that. So if you have a VM that's 50 gigs in size, every single time you back that up, you lose 50 gigs. Surely there's a better way. Yeah, deduplication. So what that means is it only backs up files that have changed. So you're always going to have to do that initial backup, so that 50 gigs. But if on a weekly basis you're backing up and you've only written a gig, that means your next backup is likely to be much smaller, around a gig. So you can obviously see the benefits here. And if we head over to my Proxmox in a minute, you'll see that in action. So here over on my Proxmox Backup Server, you can see this interesting statistic here on the summary. Deduplication factor 6.12. So that means for all of the storage I'm using, I've got 8 groups with 24 snapshots. That's basically 8 VMs I'm backing up, and I keep the last 3 backups. But I'm saving over 6 times the size as compared with doing it through Proxmox VE, where it's doing those full-size backups. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to deploy Proxmox Backup Server, how to integrate that with Proxmox VE, and give some general tips and guidance around hardware choices for doing this. Let's get right into it. So to begin the process, we first need to download the ISO, and that's really straightforward. So head over to the Proxmox Backup Server website, and then you need to head over to the download section. And we're going to be using Proxmox Backup Server, and we're going to be using version 3.0 ISO installer. Go ahead and download that, and once you're done, we'll move on to the next stage. So the next stage is installation, and it's no coincidence that I'm in Proxmox. So you might think traditionally that you want to install this on some bare metal and get that up and running. You might want to then put lots of drives into that box and use it in that fashion. And there's nothing particularly wrong with that, but I like to virtualize my setup, and I already have existing infrastructure set up for my backups. So in this instance, I'm going to virtualize Proxmox Backup Server. And that's what you can see on the screen, and you can see this has been up and running for 108 days. Now the way this works is, it's deployed onto my Dell, which is part of my 2-node cluster. Yeah, I know it should be 3. But this actually resides on my local NVMe drive. Now this drive is a quad NVMe, and it's backed up with RAIDs 2, so any 2 of those drives can fail. Now all of this is actually irrelevant. Now, why is it irrelevant? Well, whilst the server itself runs on here, and I've got resiliency built in, actually, when we get into this post-deployment, and going back to my previous Proxmox server, it actually saves it to this location down here. And as you can see, this is 108 terabytes. This is my TrueNAS. So effectively, all I'm doing is giving a very minimalist installation for Proxmox Backup Server. I want something light, because it's not really going to be doing anything that intensive. It's simply a web GUI and some backend services so that I can use my existing TrueNAS with all of its RAID 2 built into it, but with the benefits of Proxmox Backup Server giving me deduplication. So whilst this is going to take up a little bit of CPU, a little bit of RAM, and a little bit of hard drive space to actually host this server, the benefits of 6 times deduplication in my instance massively outweighs it. So let's get on to installation. Okay, so I've now hopped over to a fresh Proxmox installation. Well, tell a lie, it's actually one I've used for a previous demonstration, but it suits the needs of this video perfect. So we're now going to walk through the process to install Proxmox Backup Server. So this machine only has 8 cores and 16 gigs of RAM, but that's more than enough. So I'm going to create a new virtual machine, but before I do that, I need to make sure that the ISO installation media is available. So to do that, we want to move over to our local storage or wherever you're storing your ISOs. This is just the default location. And I'm going to upload. So I'm going to select a file from my PC as I've already downloaded it before. I'm going to hit open, and then that should upload. So once that's uploaded, that's going to enable us to select this as an installation media when we create the virtual machine. So now that that's completed, let's head over to Create VM. I'm going to choose this node, obviously, and I'm going to give it the name of Proxmox Backup Server. As this is a backup, I want to make sure that it runs at boot. And that's all I need to do on this screen. So hit next. Now for the OS, this is where we can select what we just downloaded. So here you see Proxmox Backup Server 3. I'm going to click that one. It is a guest type of Linux and it is using the 6.x kernel. So we're going to hit next. The system we can leave as default because we're not going to be doing anything fancy for it. So no Q35s, no pass-through, etc. If you wanted to do an all-in-one solution where you were passing your disks through to Proxmox in a virtualized environment, you would need to have a Q35 machine. Go and check out my previous video on hardware pass-through to see how to do that. So on the next screen, as I mentioned, I'm just using this as a bare bones, basically the web GUI and the backend services. So I don't need anything fancy and I don't need a large amount of storage. So in this instance, I'm just going to store it on the same location as Proxmox is installed, but if you've got nice, fast local storage, so maybe some SSDs or NVMe, I recommend you choose that. In terms of disk size, I'm going to leave it at the default of 32. That's more than I need, but I've got some to spare. And you can tweak that down to probably something like 20 gigs. I'm going to turn on SSD emulation so it enables trim for this virtual machine so that when something is marked for deletion, it can actually go back and reclaim some of that space. It's a handy feature. Not a lot of people probably know about that. So hit next, and then for CPU, I've only got one socket in this machine. It's an old consumer Intel. I'm going to give it 2 cores. I'm going to change this to be a host so it gets the full feature suite of the CPU. And then I'm going to hit next. For memory, I'm going to give this 4 gigs of RAM. And I'm going to disable ballooning just so it's got fixed allocation size. And typically, it's just going to hit that limit anyway in a short amount of time. Next, onto network. Again, you need to tweak this to your settings. As this is just a simple demonstration, I'm not going to do anything fancy with any VLANs. So I'm going to leave it as default and then hit finish. So now we get a summary of our virtual machine. Everything is fine to get this up and running. So once that's being created, we can then click on it over here and we're going to jump into the console to get this installation started. So hopping over to the console, let's hit start. So I'm going to keep this simple and we're going to do the graphical installation. As you can see, it's picked up an IP address from my network, so that's great. Often it will need to do software updates during the installation process. So now we're here, we can hit agree in the bottom right hand corner. And once we hit agree, we're asked which target hard disk. Now, I've only installed the one disk, so I'm going to leave this as default. But if you remember from my previous videos where we've installed Proxmox, for example, you may have multiple drives here that you want to select. And you can also do things like installing this in various RAID configurations. That's useful if you're going to be using this to pass through disks or it's on bare metal. As I've said, this will be installed locally on the Proxmox drive, but as I showed earlier in my production environment, that's already on RAID infrastructure, and so I don't need to worry about specifying it within this virtual machine. So I'm going to hit next. Next, we're going to need to have a password. Once you've completed that, you can hit the next. And then it's going to ask you to set up your networking. Now, as I've got DHCP enabled, this has been pre-populated for me. So all of that looks good to me, but obviously make sure you double check and you can actually reach this, and it can reach things like the internet. For the FQDN, you can put in pretty much whatever you want. You don't actually have to use this, and you can route it through things like your reverse proxy at a later time, but maybe you want to give it something easy to remember. So I'm going to call mine pbs.jimsgarage.co.uk, and I'm going to hit next. Then it's going to ask us to validate all of the installation options. All of that looks fine, and I'm going to let it reboot after an installation. So let's hit install. I'm going to skip this part of the video because there's nothing really to look at, and I'll see you on the other side. So now it's finished, we're reminded of the IP address for this machine. So you could see that it was 115 and then port 8007. So that's one port higher than Proxmox. So pretty easy to remember. So now it's rebooted, everything looks fine. It's going to automatically start up. So yeah, welcome to Grub, and it's doing the first steps for its first boot up. That's great. So now we can leave Proxmox Backup Server and we can access it through the web GUI. And again, here's just a gentle reminder on screen. It's at 115.8007 for me. Remember, if you want to access this through the web GUI, it does use a self-signed web certificate, so you do need HTTPS. And so heading to that website, we get the following warning. It's a self-signed certificate. We want to ignore this, and let's continue. Now, hopefully we should reach the login screen, and yes, we do. So let's log in, and the username by default is root, and put in your password that you specified during the installation process. So once we've done that, we're greeted with the dashboard. Now this looks almost identical to the machine I showed you before, which was my production environment. And everything looks to be up and running. We've got 2 cores, and it even reads out the CPU name because I did the host pass-through, and it has the 4 gigs of RAM that I specified. So fingers crossed, we're in a good position to get this up and running now. So you could just use this as is and create backups on this backup server if you provisioned it with commensurate hard drive space. But the way I'm going to do it is to leverage my existing setup. So in summary, you can either use this as is, or you can use some external storage. Most people will have an external NAS, so that's what we're going to treat this one as. Now, unfortunately, there isn't a simple way of doing this through the GUI. We need to hop into the terminal and enable CIFS, CIF utils to be precise, and then we need to mount the SMB share to a location within the virtual machine for Proxmox Backup Server, and then we can specify it as a data source. So let's jump into the terminal now and do that. So now that I'm logged into this virtual machine, let's get into it. So the first thing we're going to want to do is to install CIF utils. So the first thing we want to do is to install CIF utils. So an apt install CIF utils. Remember, we're already logged in as root. So that's already installed. Next, and like some of my previous videos, before we can mount something, we need to create a folder first for it to be mounted to. So I'm going to create a directory in the /mnt mount and then call a directory. So I'm going to create make directory /mount, and then I'm going to call this one TrueNAS. So that's going to create that folder. And now we're ready to add our SMB credentials to mount TrueNAS. So I'm going to add an SMB credentials file, and later we can reference that. So choose your text editor of choice. I prefer Nano. And then we're going to do /etc/samba and then /.smb_creds. And then in here, I'm going to specify a username and password. Now, this is the username and password that you will already have assigned to your SMB share. So put that one in here. The format that you need to specify is the following, and we'll reference these variables in a minute. So now that's complete, as a quick security step, we can just change that file permission to be read-only by root. And to do that, you just do a chmod 400. These are additional steps, but just good practice. So now that we've done that, we're ready to do the actual mount command. And if you've ever done this before in Linux, it's pretty much identical. So the command to do this is mount and then CIFS. We want to pass it in the credentials that we used here. So those were the ones we just created above and changed the permissions for. The next part will be the IP address and the share name of your SMB share. And then the last parameter is that folder we created just up here. So with any luck, when I hit return, this is going to mount my NAS to that folder. So let's run it and let's go and validate that. Okay, so ignoring the slash that I missed out on the first command, that looks like it's worked okay. So I'm going to look in that folder now just to check that it's mounted okay. So now I've created this folder here, so this test Proxmox Backup Server for this video, and you can see in here in my Windows Explorer that I've got my TrueNAS address and I've also got this folder. So we know now that this is mounted to the Proxmox Backup Server and hopefully I can start using this. So how do we do that? Well, let's head back into Proxmox Backup Server and we're going to want to create a data store. So now back in my new Proxmox Backup Server, I can hit add a data store. Now I'm just going to call this one test PBS, just so it's different from my main one. And then I need to choose a backing path. Now what's the backing path? Well, it's where you're going to store this. So remember, we've mounted a folder to our Proxmox Backup Server, and that had the address of /mnt TrueNAS /test-pbs. So that's okay. Now we might also want to look at the prune options. So what are the prune options? No, it's not that sweet fruit. It's how much data we want to retain. So a bit like we did back in the Restic video, it's all about data retention. So let's do something sensible like keep the last 3. We're going to keep the last 1 daily, the last 1 monthly, something like that. Have a read up in the documentation if you're not familiar with what this means, but it's basically how many snapshots of varying time frequencies you want to keep. So I'm going to click add now, and that should now create a data store in that folder. So let's now go and have a look in my Windows Explorer just to see if any folders have been created. So yeah, they have. And you can see that there's a .lock and a .chunks. Well, the lock file is for locking access to the folder, but also the chunks. Now, the way deduplication works is it breaks down this storage space into chunks. And when it does a backup, it looks for differences in chunk size. So you can actually tweak this to make it really small, but it can have significant performance impacts. So I recommend leave it as default. So what would happen is if it wrote, for example, in 10 megabyte blocks, if the 10 megabytes was the same as before, it'd just make a reference that it was the same. However, if those 10 megabytes were different, it would have to rewrite it and add it. So depending on how much storage space you're going to give this, it can take a long time. So don't worry if it's sat there spinning. It depends on how much storage space you've given it, but just let it run, and when it's finished, we're on to the next step. Now, if you want to, you can click on the output tab and it will show you the percentage it's got to. So like I say, it can take a while depending on how much hardware you've got, i.e. CPU, and also the speed of the drives it's storing it to. Okay, so now that's completed, and just for reference, I think that took about 25 minutes on my machine. Now, once that's completed, you should be presented with this page. If you're getting a permissions denied issue, there's a fix for that. And the fix is this. Back on the previous command, you can see that I've amended it with a comma and then user ID of 34 and the group ID of 34. Now, that is the backup user by default for Proxmox Backup Server. So before, if you got permission denied, it's because that user didn't have access to it. So now we've granted permission. So if you're getting an error on screen, come back and do this. I'll drop this command into my GitHub. Now that we've mounted it and everything seems to be working in the background, we want to make this persistent. So we're going to add this command to our FS tab so that on boot, each time this is loaded up and mounted. So to do that, use your text editor and open up FS tab. And you'll find that in etc and then FS tab. And once you're in there, we need to add a command to load this. So we create a new line at the bottom and we want to copy and paste the following command. It looks very similar to the previous mount command. And so the final command will look like this. we specify the IP address and the mount. We specify where we want to mount it to locally. So that's mount/test PBS. It's type CIFS for SMB, version 3, the same credentials, and crucially, we've still got the user ID and group ID, and then some defaults and then 00. So once we've got that in place, we can save it. And now every time we reboot, it should automatically mount this so that that data store is up and available. Brilliant. So let's get into how we use this now. So back in PBS, you can see that I've got my data store up here and running. And if we hop now back into Proxmox, so here we are back in Proxmox. And now if I go to the data center at the top, we can add some storage. And so to add the storage, we click Add, and then Proxmox Backup Server. So the ID, I'm just going to put this in as test-pbs. The server is going to be the IP, so 192.168.7.115. The username will be root@pbs, and you can change this if you need to. The password will be the password I specified within the installation. The data store will be test-pbs, and the important bit is to get the fingerprint. Now we need to go back to our PBS server to get the fingerprint, so let's do that quickly. Now in PBS, you want to go to Configuration Certificates, and then you want to find the proxy PEM and then click View Certificate. And here you'll get the fingerprint. So we can just select this, copy it, and then we'll take this back to our Proxmox server and we'll paste it into the field. So now we're back here, we can paste this in here, and with any luck we can click Add and then we'll get it added to our Proxmox server. Oops, a quick error, that should be PAM. So now let's add it, and there you go, straight away we've got test PBS, and that's now available. And you can now see this over here on the left hand side, and it's got all of the details available for that storage. So now we can go to one of our Docker VMs like this, and we could do a backup, and we can say backup now. And instead of the storage being local, we can do test PBS. And we can now use this storage with the benefits of deduplication. Brilliant. And moreover, you could also do something like a scheduled backup. So if you head into your data center and then you hit backup, you can add a backup here, and then you can select all of the virtual machines that you want to. So again, we'll change this storage to be the test, which is our new one. And then we can select a schedule. So I don't know, let's say we do this every day at 9 o'clock. We can even send out emails if you've got SMTP set up, which will be really useful because it will give you an alert as to whether it's completed successfully or whether there were issues. So for this one, I could click this virtual machine here, and then I could click Create. You could also repeat missed ones, so if you've just missed it, it will go and do it. So if I click Create, that's now going to do it. And so on the 10th of the 11th, that's going to run at 9 o'clock, and it's going to back up to my TrueNAS, courtesy of my Proxmox virtual machine PBS. Now, I could also add this to my other node, and if I joined it into the Proxmox cluster, you'll see that this storage is available to both of those nodes. I'll show you that in my production environment now. So now back over in my production Proxmox, you can see I've got my Dell and my Asus, and the Proxmox Backup Server is here, and is also down here. So you can just use that for either of these nodes, and after a while, once you've got this storage backup in here, I can actually then go and check in my PBS like I showed you at the beginning of the video. You'll see all of those backups happening, and in PBS, where I am now, you'll be able to click on the content and you'll be able to see all of the virtual machines that have been backed up, and you can see each one of those backups. Now remember, this is saying 20 gig for each one, but if we check the actual summary, we'll see that 6.12. So when I restore this, it will come back as 20 gigs, but actually those incremental snapshots, they aren't 20 gigs. It's benefiting from a 6.12 times reduction in storage space. So I hope you find that a useful demonstration of how you can improve your backup strategy specifically for Proxmox virtual machines. Let me know in the comments below if this is something that you're going to implement, and hey, why don't you tell me how much storage you've spaced just by doing this method. So as always guys, thanks for watching, please give it a like, please hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care everybody.